All right. Sorry for the delay, everyone. I was working on this homework assignment of my own. Hope everybody is healthy and everything. The situation in Wisconsin seems worse than it is in Virginia right now, so I guess we'll see. So anyways, we're going to talk about fraction multiplication, which we already did in class, but very briefly. So let's go. So I guess unlike addition, the formula for multiplication is very easy. Basically, what this formula says is to multiply two fractions, just multiply the numerators and multiply the denominators. So very easy to know, but example, 3/8 times 4/5 is just the answer. 3/8 times 4/5 is just numerator times numerator over denominator times denominator. So 12 over 40, which would simplify to something else. But as always, we don't want to just say what the rule is. We want to be able to explain why is this rule true. And why is this true? It's kind of like a little bit mysterious or whatever. And that's what we did when we talked about the addition rule, basically. We broke it down. Why does our method, we have a formula for fraction addition, but why does it work? Well, it works because we can change fractions into having a common denominator. We can change 1/2 plus 1/4. We can, given two fractions, the main point was given two fractions, we can always change them into two equivalent fractions with a common denominator. And once you get a common denominator, it makes total sense how you would add those. What's 2/4 plus 1/4? 3/4, because you're combining, basically just combining counts of quarters. So that was our explanation of why fraction addition worked, and now we want to do the same thing for fraction multiplication. So I guess, as always, we have to refer back to what does multiplication even mean in the first place. And basically, multiplication means groups of or measurements of. For example, 2 times 4 means two groups of 4. And here's two groups of 4. We know that we can just count two groups of 4 by hand and figure out that the answer is 8. We can figure out from scratch that 2 times 4 is equal to 8. So this makes perfect sense for fractions also, is basically the deal. If 2 times 4 means two groups of 4, then what does 1/2 times 4 mean? Is this a highlight tool? Yes, it is. I want to use this. Okay. So if 2 times 4 means two groups of 4, then 1/2 times 4, that should mean a half group of 4, right? And what's a half group of 4? It's 2. So remember at the very beginning of the semester, we really dug into the details and explained from scratch, why is 2 times 4 equal to 8? Well, because it's repeated addition and blah, blah, blah. Same deal here. Why is 1/2 times 4 equal to 2? It's because multiplication means groups of, and a half group of 4 is 2. That's what this picture is showing us. What this is trying to do is, here's a group of 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And what's half of this group of 4? It's 2, right? In other words, 1/2 times 1/4 is equal to 2. Sorry, this writing is so poor. I wish I had a pen tool or something. But I don't. 1/2 times 1/4 equals to 2, and here's the visual explanation why. So notice that multiplying 4 by a half is the same as dividing 4 by 2. This is true in general. Yes, this is true in general. What's half of a group of 4? It's the same as 4 divided by 2. What's 1/3 of something? It's the same thing as dividing by 3. And so what that last slide is, and remember you can find the slides in the Google Drive, what that last slide said is that in general, this is how you multiply a fraction with numerator 1 and a whole number. And this kind of makes sense. Remember, kind of in the first place, a quarter is the number that splits 1 into 4 pieces. So a fourth of 32 should mean the same thing as 32 divided into 4. Sorry, that's not what I meant to write. 1/4 times 32 is the same thing as, this handwriting is horrible. Divided by 4. So this goes back to what fractions mean in the first place. Fraction means basically splitting up units into pieces. Multiplication means groups of. So what's a quarter of 32? That means splitting 32 into 4 pieces, which is the same thing as 32 divided by 4. So the moral of the story is, which is what it said in the last slide, this is how you multiply a fraction with numerator 1 and a whole number. So this is basically part 1 of our explanation. How does fraction multiplication work? And step 1 of that explanation is, well, let's break it down. Why does fraction multiplication for this special type of two numbers make sense? So more examples. What's an eighth times 7? It's 7/8 because okay, had to change locations for a second there. So let me repeat this slide. 1/8 times the 7th, what does that mean? It means an eighth of a group of 7. What is that? That means 7 split into 8 parts, and that's what the fraction 7/8 means kind of in the first place. So kind of what we're doing together is we're tying together kind of multiplication of fractions and division, and we also said that division and fractions are kind of the same thing also. 7/8, what does that represent? That represents the measurement of 7 split evenly into 8 pieces, and that's the same thing as 7 divided by 8. So this is like everything is kind of clicking together. So let's see. And remember also that whole numbers are fractions too. 7 is the same thing as 7/1, right? Because 7/1 is the same thing as 7 divided by 1, right? Which is 7. So the point is, this is an explanation of a very special example of fraction multiplication when one of the fractions has numerator 1 and one of the fractions is a whole number. That's what we're doing right now. Another summary. We learned how to multiply a whole number and a fraction with numerator 1. And whole numbers are fractions too, so we're just explaining a very specific example of the fraction multiplication formula, which is the case when one of the numerators is 1 and the other denominator is 1. That's the special example we're showing why that formula for fraction multiplication works. And it works because kind of like fractions and division tie together so nicely. Okay, now we're going to multiply 2 fractions with numerator 1. That's the next goal. So what is a half times a quarter? Well, I think we can kind of just see from the picture. Well, we know what's a half times a quarter. That means half of a quarter. That means a quarter split into 2 pieces. And what is a quarter split into 2 pieces? Well, I think we know it. It's 1/8. So we're going to kind of break this down a little bit more. Half times a quarter is equal to 1/8 because 1/8 is the fraction that splits a quarter into 2 parts. But also notice that, how do we figure out this number? 8 well, 2 times 4 is equal to 8. And this kind of makes sense, so let's break it down a little bit more. So basically the rule for multiplying two fractions with numerator 1 is going to be multiply the denominators. That's what's happening here, right? What's 1 over 2 times 1 over 4? It's 1 over 2 times 4 is 1 over 8. And this makes sense from the picture. So if you think about it, this is kind of why this rule works. Let's try to think through this explanation of why this rule works. Well, a quarter is the number that splits a unit into 4 equal pieces. A unit is equal to 4 quarters. And an eighth is the measurement that splits a unit into 8 equal pieces. So what we want to know is, what is the fraction a half times a quarter? A half times a quarter, what fraction is that equal to? That's what we want to know. And okay, so if you think about it, when you multiply a number by a quarter, that's the same as splitting the number into 4 pieces, because fractions and divisions are kind of the same. Multiplying a number by a quarter is the same as dividing that number by 4. That's what we had talked about before. And multiplying a number by a half, that's the same as splitting that number into 2, dividing that number by 2. So if you multiply a number by a half and then if you multiply a number by a quarter and then by a half, that's the same as splitting the measurement into 4 pieces and then splitting each of those 4 pieces into 2 pieces, just like in the picture. Multiplying by a quarter then a half, that's the same as splitting the measurement into 4 pieces, and then each of those 4 pieces into 2 pieces, just like in the picture. Here's 1 unit split into 4 pieces, and now each of those 4 pieces, when we multiply by a half, are being split into 2 pieces. Each of those quarters are being split into 2 pieces. So what's the point? When you multiply by a quarter and then by a half, that's the same as splitting into 8 pieces, because you're splitting into 4, and then each of those 4 you're splitting into 2. So how many split groups are you making in total? 4 times 2, which is equal to 8. So I hope that makes sense. That's the explanation of why a half times a quarter is equal to 1/8, and in general, why this rule for multiplying fractions with denominator 1 works. Because when you multiply by a half, a quarter, then a half, you're splitting into 4 groups, and then each of those 4 groups, you're splitting into 2 groups. So how many groups do you make total? 2 times 4 is equal to 8. And splitting into 8 groups, that's the same as multiplying by 1/8. So the conclusion is, therefore, 1/2 times a quarter is equal to 1/8. Here's another example. So our rule that we're explaining says 1 over 7 times 1 over 3 should be equal to 1 over 7 times 3 is 21. And the slides explain this in writing. Well, multiplying by a seventh is the same as splitting the unit into sevenths, like here. And then multiplying that seventh by a third, that's the same as splitting each of those sevenths into 3 pieces. So what's a seventh times a third? That represents splitting into 7 and then splitting each of those 7 into 3, which is the same as splitting into 21, because you're splitting into 7 and each of those 7 you're splitting into 3. 7 times 3 is 21. That's the total number of groups you're making if you split into 7 and then you split into 3. And therefore, multiplying by 7, then multiplying by 3 is the same as dividing by 21, which is the same as multiplying by 1 over 21. So this is why fraction multiplication works. So now we know 2 things. We know how to multiply a fraction with numerator 1 and a whole number, and we know how to multiply 2 fractions with numerator 1. And kind of putting these 2 pieces of puzzle are enough to explain the whole complete rule for fraction multiplication. So now we want to know in general, how do you multiply two fractions? So we want just a general explanation of why all fraction multiplication works. And we figured out two pieces of the puzzle. We figured out how to multiply a fraction and a whole number, and we figured out how to multiply two fractions with numerator 1. So how are we going to explain the complete fraction multiplication rule? Well, we're going to use those two pieces of the puzzle we figured out. So we're going to figure out from scratch, what is 2/3 times 5/8? Well, first we're going to use so first we're going to use our rule for dealing with whole numbers. So our rule for dealing with whole numbers said 2 times a third is the same as 2/3, which makes sense. What is 2/3? It's 2 groups of a third. What is 5/8? It's 5 groups of an eighth. So it's kind of step 1 of the explanation. Step 2, we're going to use associativity and commutativity. We took these original two fractions that we were multiplying together. We split them up into whole numbers and fractions with numerator 1. And now we're kind of regrouping. We're pulling aside the whole numbers and the fractions with numerator 1. So we took our original fraction multiplication and then we split it into two parts. And so this little sidebar here is just saying that, well, why are we allowed to use associativity and commutativity for fraction multiplication? Well, the same explanations as before work just as well. Why is fraction multiplication commutative? Well, the exact same reason as before. Basically, a 1/3 by 1/8 grid is the same as a 1/8 by 1/3 grid. And the product 1/3 times 1/8 would be the area of that grid. So anyways, so here's kind of this 2 steps. Start with this fraction multiplication, split it up into these pieces. And now, what do we have? 2 times 5 is 10, 3 times 8 is 24. We're left with a whole number times a fraction with numerator 1, which is 10 over 24. So this is exactly what our fraction formula tells us. What's 2/3 times 5/8? Well, the formula says it's numerator times numerator, which is 2 times 5 is 10, over denominator times denominator. 3 times 8 is 24. And this is kind of why it works. We had those long explanations of whole number times fraction with numerator 1 and fraction with numerator 1 times fraction with numerator 1. We had those 2 long explanations. And kind of putting those together is enough to explain all of fraction multiplication, because you can kind of always split up a given fraction multiplication like this. So in general, in the future, when you're off teaching and whatever, this is not anything to worry about too much. But this is just, at the end of the day, all you need to know is the rule for how to multiply two fractions. But it's nice to be able to give yourself an explanation of why it works. And it's easiest to explain the simpler examples. Why whole number times a certain why whole number times 1 over a number makes sense. That makes sense because fractions and division are kind of the same thing. And also, why does 1 over a fraction times 1 over a fraction make sense? Well, it's because of kind of those pie chart diagrams. So here's another example just to make sure we're on the same page about how to multiply fractions. What's 9/4 times 10/12? It's 9 times 10 divided by 4 times 12, which is 90 over 48. And we want to get good at simplifying fractions also. We can divide numerator and denominator both by 2 in this step. 90 divided by 2 is 45. 48 divided by 2 is 24. And now we can divide numerator and denominator both by 3 to get the simplified fraction. Cool. So one of the more difficult topics, I think, but hopefully that went okay. Let me know any questions. I'll be in touch soon about setting up office hours.